It started here. April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire on a small Union garrison at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. 34 hours of bombardment later, the Union troops surrendered. The Civil War had begun. 3 months later, both sides expected a quick fight. At Bull Run, Virginia, that illusion died. Union troops broke and fled back toward Washington. The first sign this war would not be short or easy. By spring 1862, the Union tried a new approach, landing an army on the Virginia Peninsula to march straight for Richmond, the Confederate capital. Confederate defenses at Yorktown slowed that advance to a crawl. What was meant to be a quick strike became a siege. Tens of thousands of Union troops camped along the Pamunkey River, waiting. One of the largest armies ever assembled on American soil, stalled before it had even reached the enemy capital. Behind them, a supply base grew. The logistics of feeding and arming an army this size were in themselves a new kind of war. Near Richmond, Union troops finally clashed with Confederate forces under Stonewall Jackson. The Peninsula Campaign had turned into open battle, and the casualties were staggering. Even as armies clashed hundreds of miles away, the system the war was fought over kept running. On plantations still under Confederate control, enslaved labor continued, a reminder of what was actually at stake. Regiments like New York's 69th Infantry, many of them Irish immigrants, were becoming some of the Union's most storied fighting units. On the water, a new kind of warship was being tested. Ironclads, built to survive cannon fire that would have sunk a wooden hull in minutes. By September, the armies collided at Antietam, Maryland, still the bloodiest single day in American history. Detective Allen Pinkerton, running Union intelligence, rode the field as roughly 23,000 men fell in 12 hours. The scale of the dead at Antietam shocked the country. Photography had never shown Americans a battlefield like this before, and it wouldn't let them look away. For the South, Antietam was a defeat it couldn't fully absorb. An invasion of the North turned back at enormous cost. In the capital, life went on around an unfinished Capitol dome. Construction paused, then resumed, as if the government refused to admit the war might not be won. Union regiments kept refilling their ranks, drilling, waiting for the next campaign. The grinding routine between the battles nobody remembers. At Fredericksburg, Union troops finally broke a Confederate line that had held once before, but the price, on both sides, kept climbing. Then came Gettysburg, 3 days in Pennsylvania, over 50,000 casualties, and the Confederacy's last real invasion of the North was broken for good. Even the artillery itself couldn't withstand what this war demanded of it. Guns burst apart under the strain of sustained bombardment. On the Mississippi, Union gunboats like the Essex helped tighten a stranglehold on Confederate river traffic, cutting the South in two. And just miles from the Union capital, storefronts still openly advertised the sale of human beings, proof of how far slavery still reached, even deep into wartime. By 1864, the fighting had changed character. Grant pushed south relentlessly. Wilderness, Spotsylvania, battles that produced casualties on a scale even Antietam hadn't matched. Behind every advance was an army of engineers, building roads, bridges, and crossings under fire, just to keep the campaign moving. At Cold Harbor, Union assaults were cut down in minutes. What was left behind, for others to bury, showed exactly what grinding attrition meant. Outside Petersburg, the war settled into something new. Trench lines, siege warfare, a preview of conflicts 50 years in the future. Nowhere was the human cost clearer than Andersonville, a Confederate prison camp where roughly 13,000 of 45,000 Union prisoners died of starvation and disease. Rations here were barely enough to survive on, a slow death sentence for men who'd already survived the battlefield. In Georgia, Sherman's army closed in on Atlanta, a rail and manufacturing hub the Confederacy couldn't afford to lose. When Atlanta fell, it wasn't just a city that changed hands. It was the Confederacy's supply lines being severed. Sherman didn't just take Atlanta, he broke it, then turned his army toward the sea, burning a path of destruction meant to end the war by ending the South's ability to fight it. One image says more than any caption could. A black soldier, now in Union uniform, standing guard in front of the very building where people had once been sold. By 1864, roughly 180,000 black soldiers were serving in the Union Army, men who had everything to fight for and no illusions about what defeat would mean. For men who had escaped slavery, a soldier's uniform and a soldier's pay were not small things. They were proof the world was actually changing. Across the Western Theater, Union control of key cities like Nashville was tightening the Confederacy's grip on its own territory. New technology kept reshaping the war, including aerial reconnaissance, decades before anyone would call it that. Behind every battle photo was this: hospital wards filled past capacity, a side of the war just as real as the front lines. By this point in the war, the machinery of it had become industrial, production lines built for nothing but ammunition. Captured Confederate soldiers now moved through Union hands by the thousands. The manpower one side needed, the other could no longer replace. The Confederacy even had a warship built in France, but by the time it crossed the Atlantic in 1865, the war it was built for was already over. As Sherman's army moved north through the Carolinas, Columbia burned, another southern capital left in ruins. After a 9-month siege, Petersburg finally fell, and with it, the last real defense of Richmond collapsed. Union engineers threw bridges across the rivers in the Confederacy's path. There was nowhere left to hold the line. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was set ablaze by its own retreating army rather than let it fall intact to the Union. What Confederate troops didn't burn, they blew up, denying the Union anything of military value on their way out. A week after Richmond fell, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. After 4 years, the Confederacy's army, the thing holding the whole cause together, was gone. Towns across Virginia bore the scars of battles fought through their streets and fields, years after the fighting had moved on. That November, Henry Wirz, the commander of Andersonville, was tried and hanged for the deaths under his command. It was the only war crimes execution of the entire conflict. More than 600,000 Americans died in 4 years, a number greater than every other American war combined. What survived was a country forced finally to answer the question it had been avoiding since its founding.